April 14, 1945, the Ruhr Pocket. The night sky tore apart in jagged orange seams. Oberleutnant Helmut Hessa felt the blast before he heard it, a wall of compressed air that lifted him off his boots and slammed him into the mud like a discarded doll. His ears filled with a high, thin whine that swallowed all other sound. The world tilted sideways. When he tried to push himself upright, his left arm folded at an angle arms should never fold, and the pain arrived a heartbeat later, white-hot and absolute. Through the ringing in his skull, he caught fragments. Boots pounding past, someone screaming orders in German that sounded like they were shouting from the bottom of a well, the crackle of small arms fire stitching the darkness. His arm hung useless, the bone grinding against itself with each attempt to move. Blood, warm and sticky, traced a line down his temple. He tasted copper and dirt. Get up. You have to get up. His body refused. The ground beneath him trembled with the passage of retreating vehicles, the desperate scramble of units trying to break through American lines that had closed around them like a fist. Somewhere in his concussed brain, Hesse understood. The pocket was collapsing. The war, for him, was ending. Not with a bullet, not with a last stand. With mud in his mouth and his arm shattered, and the certainty that captivity meant only one thing. He had seen what happened to captured officers, had heard the stories whispered in dugouts, passed along supply lines with the same urgency as ammunition counts. Interrogation, retribution. The Americans would want names, positions, intelligence. They would see his rank insignia, the twin silver pips of an Oberleutnant, and they would know he was worth questioning. Hard. When the boot stopped beside his head, Helmut Hesse closed his eyes and waited for whatever came next. In the 18 months before that blast knocked him unconscious, Hesse had constructed a careful architecture of beliefs about the enemy. It was built from official pronouncements, from propaganda films shown in requisition cinemas, from the casual certainty of officers who had never seen an American up close, but spoke with the authority of men who had memorized doctrine. The Americans, they said, were soft, undisciplined. They fought with machines because they lacked the spiritual fortitude for true combat. They came from a mongrel nation with no sense of history, no warrior tradition, no understanding of sacrifice. When they took prisoners, it was said, they were either careless, leaving wounded to die in the open, or brutal, particularly toward officers who represented the German military hierarchy they had been taught to despise. Hesse had accepted these narratives not because he examined them closely, but because they fit neatly into the larger structure of meaning that made the war comprehensible. If the enemy was weak, then German losses were temporary setbacks, tactical adjustments. If the enemy was barbarous, then German conduct was justified, even noble by comparison. The architecture held because no one looked too hard at the foundations. Now, lying in the mud, with his consciousness flickering like a candle in wind, those beliefs were all he had left. The hands that lifted him were not rough. Hesse surfaced from darkness to find himself on a canvas stretcher, being carried with practiced efficiency through the chaos of the collapsing front. The faces above him were shadowed, unfamiliar, speaking in low, urgent English. Medics. American medics. One of them, young, maybe 22, with a soft southern accent Hesse wouldn't identify until much later, checked his pulse, then called out something about tachycardia and possible internal bleeding. They moved him quickly but carefully, avoiding the worst of the ruts in the torn earth. When he groaned, the pain in his arm was a living thing now, clawing up his shoulder into his neck. Someone adjusted the stretcher's angle and spoke in a tone Hesse recognized. The specific, professional gentleness of a man managing pain he cannot yet eliminate. Easy now, buddy. We got you. Buddy. The word made no sense. He was Wehrmacht. They were the enemy. The script called for different language. Prisoner, German, target. Not buddy. Not the casual intimacy of soldiers who shared a trench. The aid station resolved out of the darkness like a stage set under sudden lights. Canvas tents glowing from within. The organized chaos of triage, the smell of antiseptic cutting through the smoke and cordite. They carried him past rows of wounded, some in American olive drab, some in German field gray, and he waited for the separation, for the moment when enemy wounded would be diverted to some darker corner, some lower priority. It never came. They laid him on a gurney beside an American private whose face was the color of old paper, whose breath came in shallow gasps, whose right leg ended in a mass of bloody bandages below the knee. A doctor, clean-shaven, wire-rimmed glasses catching the light, moved between them with the same swift assessment, checking pupils, palpating abdomen, calling out treatment priorities and clipped medical shorthand. Compound fracture, left humerus, probable concussion, BP 90/60. Get him stabilized for surgery. A nurse appeared at Hessa's side, her hands cool and certain as she began cutting away his uniform sleeve. She worked around the bend in his arm with careful precision, muttering something about keeping the limb immobilized. When she set the temporary splint, wooden slats wrapped in gauze, the pain spiked so sharply Hessa's vision went white at the edges. "I know," she said quietly, not looking at his face. "I know it hurts. We're going to fix it." An anesthesiologist leaned over him, a mask in hand, eyes kind above the surgical mask. "Breathe deep for me," he said in accented German. "The pain will stop soon." Hessa tried to form words, to ask where they were taking him, what they would do, whether this mercy was real or some elaborate prelude to interrogation. But the ether was already pulling him down into darkness, and the last thing he registered was the absence of anger in their faces, the sheer ordinariness of their professionalism, the way they touched his broken body with the same care they had shown the bleeding American beside him. The surgery took 3 hours and 40 minutes. Later, much later, Hessa would request his medical file, a thick folder of forms and charts and surgical notes, and read the clinical account of what they had done. The orthopedic surgeon, a captain named Morrison from Philadelphia, had opened the arm, realigned the shattered humerus, inserted 2 steel pins, and closed the wound in layers. The anesthesiologist had monitored his vitals throughout, adjusting the gas mixture twice when his blood pressure dropped. A surgical nurse named Patterson had assisted, her handwriting neat in the instrument count at the bottom of the page. Standard procedure, textbook technique, the same operation they would have performed on any soldier with a comparable injury. No one had asked him questions. No one had demanded intelligence. No one had suggested that perhaps a Wehrmacht officer with a broken arm could wait while American soldiers were treated first. When Hessa woke in the recovery ward, his arm was in a proper cast, elevated on a padded frame. His head still throbbed, but the pain had been reduced from a scream to a dull roar. The room was quiet, deliberately so, he would learn, because of his concussion, and clean in a way that seemed almost obscene given the war raging beyond the canvas walls. A British medical officer was making rounds, checking charts clipped to the end of each bed. He paused at Hessa's gurney, reviewed the surgical notes, then looked down with an expression of clinical satisfaction. Quote 6. Hessa stared at him. The question seemed to come from a different universe, one where German officers and British doctors had conversations about pain management scales instead of trying to kill each other. Quote 7. He managed in English, the word rough in his throat. The doctor made a note. Quote, he moved to leave, then paused. Quote 9, quote 10. The word came out before Hessa could stop it. The doctor looked back, genuinely puzzled. Quote 11, quote 12. Hessa gestured with his good arm, encompassing the room, the cast, the careful placement away from noise. Quote 13. Quote 14. The doctor finished. Quote 15. There was everything confusing about it, but the doctor was already moving to the next bed, and Hessa was left staring at the white canvas ceiling, trying to reconcile what he had experienced with what he had been taught to expect. The days in the ward stretched and compressed in the strange way time moves for the concussed and convalescing. Hessa relearned basic tasks with one arm: how to button a shirt, how to eat with a fork, how to tie the cord of his hospital robe into something approximating a knot. He followed the rhythm of pills distributed in small paper cups, of exercises to prevent muscle atrophy, of the nurse's twice-daily check of his cast for swelling or discoloration, and he listened. The ward held 18 beds, 10 Americans, 6 Germans, 2 Canadians. The staff rotated through shifts with military precision, but without the hierarchy of nation or allegiance Hessa had assumed would structure everything. A Canadian anesthesiologist made rounds in the morning, asking about pain levels in serviceable German. A Swiss doctor from the Red Cross mission appeared twice, checking that all prisoners were receiving proper care according to the Geneva Conventions. It was the Swiss doctor who first used the word that would lodge in Hessa's mind like a splinter. Quote 16. He said in French to the American surgeon, nodding toward Hessa's bed, "The pins should hold nicely." Colleague. The word hung in the air. Hessa's French was functional enough to understand it, and the implications crashed through him like a second blast. Not prisoner, not enemy, not even patient. Colleague, the term one professional used for another, regardless of which army they had served. No one corrected the Swiss doctor. The American surgeon simply nodded and moved on to discuss another case. The conversations Hessa overheard in those days operated on different principles than any he had known in 6 years of war. The medic spoke of saved and lost with the same raw weariness, of techniques that worked and procedures that failed, of the stubborn, grinding exhaustion of trying to repair bodies faster than combat could destroy them. They told jokes with the particular darkness of people who spent their days elbow deep in other men's blood. They argued about morphine dosages and sulfa protocols with an intensity that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with professional pride. One night, Hesse couldn't sleep for the throbbing in his arm. He heard 2 nurses talking in low voices near the supply cabinet. Quote 18. The younger one said, quote 19 Defied, quote 21. A pause, the rustle of supplies being restocked. Quote 22, quote 23, quote 24, quote 25. The older nurse's voice softened. I know, hon, but we do it anyway, because that's the job. That's the only part we can control. The conversation moved on to something about inventory and requisition forms, but Hesse lay in the darkness turning those words over. That's the only part we can control, a philosophy of war carved down to its essential element. You couldn't stop the fighting, couldn't prevent the wounds, couldn't make the madness make sense. But you could choose how you responded to the wreckage that landed at your feet. You could decide that even a broken enemy was entitled to morphine and clean bandages and a quiet room. The interrogation, when it finally came, was nothing like what Hesse had been trained to expect. A captain from Army intelligence arrived on his 6th day in the ward, pulled up a chair beside the bed, and conducted what felt more like a conversation than an inquisition. He asked about Hesse's unit, his commanding officers, the general disposition of forces in the Ruhr. His tone was professional but not aggressive. When Hesse gave name, rank, and serial number, the only information required under the Geneva Conventions, the captain nodded, made a note, and didn't push. Fair enough, he said. Can't fault a man for following the rules. He stayed for 20 minutes, talking about nothing in particular, the weather, the food, whether Hesse needed anything for his recovery. It was only later, thinking back on the conversation, that Hesse realized how much information he had inadvertently revealed, not through coercion, but through the simple human instinct to fill silences with familiar talk. But even that realization couldn't quite shake the fundamental disconnect. This was not how enemies behaved. This casual professionalism, this adherence to protocols that treated captivity as an administrative matter rather than an opportunity for revenge, belonged to some other war, some other set of rules Hesse had not been taught. The days passed. His arm began to heal, the sharp pain giving way to a duller ache. His head cleared, the fog of concussion lifting in gradual degrees. He started physical therapy, gentle exercises to prevent the joint from stiffening, guided by a physiotherapist who had the same matter-of-fact approach as everyone else. Quote 29. She instructed, demonstrating the motion with her own arm. Quote 30. Hesse worked, not because he was commanded to, but because the alternative, a permanently weakened arm, was unacceptable, and in that simple calculation he found another shift in his understanding. His captors were invested in his recovery, not as a political statement or a propaganda tool, but because leaving him broken would have violated their professional standards. They fixed him because that was what fixers of broken men did. The photograph appeared in the ward on Hesse's 10th day. Someone had taped it to the wall near the nurses' station, a snapshot of the surgical team, taken after a particularly grueling shift. Morrison, the orthopedic surgeon, stood in the center, still in his blood-stained scrubs, flanked by nurses and orderlies and the Canadian anesthesiologist. They looked exhausted and triumphant in the specific way of people who had just pulled off something difficult. Patterson, the surgical nurse, noticed Hesse looking at it. Quote 31. She said, not without pride. Quote 32. Hesse studied the faces in the photograph. There was Morrison, who had spent 3 hours and 40 minutes reconstructing his arm. There was the anesthesiologist who had whispered "breathe" deep in German. There was Patterson herself, whose neat handwriting filled his surgical report. Quote 33, he asked quietly. Patterson looked at him, puzzled. Quote 34, quote 35. She thought about it, actually had to think, counting back through the cases. Quote 36. And in that question, genuine, uncomprehending, Hesse felt another foundation crack. It didn't matter to her. The distinction he had been taught was fundamental. The line between us and them that organized all understanding was to her merely an administrative detail, relevant only for paperwork. In the operating room, there were only damaged bodies that needed repair. The spring of 1945 was coming apart. Through the ward's walls, Hesse could hear the distant thump of artillery, the rumble of supply trucks, the occasional roar of aircraft overhead. The news filtered in through whispered conversations. Through newspapers, the walking wounded passed around, through the barely concealed satisfaction of American soldiers learning that Berlin was falling, that the Reich was collapsing, that the war's end was measured now in days rather than months. Germany was dying, and Hesse was spending his time learning to button his shirt one-handed while American doctors checked his bone alignment. The dissonance was absolute. One afternoon, a new transport arrived, German prisoners from a field hospital that had been overrun in the final offensive. They came in frightened and suspicious, men who had heard the same stories Hesse had heard, who expected casual brutality or calculated neglect. Hesse watched from his bed as they were processed through triage with the same methodical efficiency, as medics checked their wounds and updated their charts and assigned them beds without regard for the uniforms they had worn. One of them, a young private with a gut wound and the gray pallor of internal bleeding, was wheeled past Hesse's bed toward emergency surgery. His eyes were wide with terror, not of death, but of what would come before it. An hour later, the same private was in recovery, stitched and stable, his life saved by the same hands that had saved Hesse's. That night, Hesse couldn't sleep. His arm throbbed despite the morphine, but the pain wasn't what kept him awake. He lay in the darkness thinking about the architecture of beliefs he had built over 18 months of war, of retreat, of propaganda absorbed and repeated, until it became indistinguishable from truth. The Americans were soft, except they had fought their way across France and Germany with mechanical efficiency. They were undisciplined, except this hospital ran with more precision than any German field station Hesse had seen. They were barbarous toward prisoners, except they had operated on his arm with the same care they showed their own wounded. Every belief, when held up to the light of experience, dissolved like mist. What remained was harder to categorize, A system of values that prioritized professional competence over national allegiance, that treated medical ethics as non-negotiable regardless of circumstance, that could look at a Wehrmacht officer with a shattered arm and see not an enemy, but a patient requiring specific intervention. It was not mercy exactly. Mercy implied benevolence, a gift from the powerful to the powerless. This was something else, a framework of mutual obligation encoded in the Geneva Conventions and reinforced by professional identity. They fixed him because that was their job, and they took their job seriously, and the question of whether he deserved it never entered the equation. In a strange way, it was more radical than kindness. Germany surrendered on the 8th of May, 1945. The news rippled through the ward with muted celebration from the American wounded and numb silence from the Germans. Hessa heard it from a nurse making evening rounds, her voice matter-of-fact as she distributed pills and checked bandages. The war's over. Official surrender at 23:41 hours yesterday. Over. 6 years of fighting, of ideology, of certainty about who the enemy was and what victory would look like. Finished. Hessa lay in his hospital bed with his arm in a cast and his head still occasionally aching and tried to feel something appropriate. Relief. Grief. Fear for what came next. What he actually felt was a peculiar lightness, as if some great weight he had been carrying without noticing had suddenly been lifted. The ward didn't change. The same routines continued. Pills at 0800 and 1400 and 2100. Physical therapy twice daily. Doctors making rounds with their clipboards and their careful assessments of healing rates. The war's end was acknowledged but not dwelt upon. There was still work to do, wounds that needed monitoring, bones that needed to knit. Hessa's cast came off on the 3rd of June, replaced by a removable splint. Morrison examined the X-rays, pronounced himself satisfied with the alignment, and gave instructions for continued therapy. Full range of motion by August if you keep up the exercises, he said. Maybe a little soreness in cold weather, but nothing that should limit function. You're going to be fine. You're going to be fine. Hesse looked at the surgeon, this American who had spent nearly 4 hours reconstructing his arm, who had cared about the work with an intensity that transcended any question of nationality, and understood that some fundamental transaction had occurred in that operating room. Not forgiveness, exactly. Not absolution for the 6 years he had spent fighting for a regime whose crimes were only now becoming fully visible, but something simpler and more profound. The recognition that he was beneath the uniform and the rank and the choices that had brought him to that muddy field, still salvageable, still capable of being fixed. The train home departed from a processing center in Bavaria on the 16th of July, 1945. Hesse traveled with 300 other former Wehrmacht. Repatriated now that the immediate chaos of surrender had subsided. They were a subdued group, men returning to a country that no longer existed in any meaningful sense, to cities that had been bombed into rubble, to families that might or might not have survived. Most talked about practical matters, where to find food, how to navigate the occupation zones, which cities still had functioning rail service. A few discussed what they would do now, return to old jobs if those jobs still existed, learn new trades if they didn't, somehow rebuild lives from the wreckage. Hesse listened but didn't participate. His arm was functional again, full range of motion restored through diligent therapy. His head had stopped aching weeks ago. Physically, he was whole. But something else had shifted during those weeks in the American hospital, something he couldn't quite articulate even to himself. It had to do with the way Patterson had looked at him when he asked which patients were German, genuinely puzzled why it mattered. It had to do with Morrison's careful reconstruction of bone that could just as easily have been left to heal crooked. It had to do with the Swiss doctor's word, colleague, and the entire framework of professional identity it implied. There was a way to serve that had nothing to do with flags or ideologies, a way to measure worth by competence rather than allegiance, a way to look at suffering and see only the work that needed doing, stripped of all the political calculations that made men into abstractions. Hesse had been trained as a soldier. He was competent at it, had risen through the ranks based on that competence. But the architecture of belief that had made soldiering meaningful had crumbled completely, and he could not reconstruct it. What remained was the memory of how it felt to be treated not as an enemy, but as a problem to be solved, a broken thing requiring specific technical intervention. The Red Cross office in Frankfurt was operating out of a converted bank building, one of the few structures in the district still intact above the second floor. Hesse walked in on the 9th of September 1945 and asked about volunteer opportunities. The woman behind the desk, Swiss, middle-aged, wearing an expression of permanent exhaustion, looked up from a stack of forms and assessed him with the same clinical efficiency Morrison had shown examining X-rays. Medical training? No, but I can learn. Languages? German, English, functional French. She made a note. We need people for family tracing, displaced persons camps, letter writing for illiterates, supply distribution. It's not glamorous work. I don't need glamorous. She studied him for a long moment, and Hesse had the distinct impression she had conducted this exact conversation 100 times before, with men who came through her door carrying the same complicated need to do something useful with skills the war had made obsolete. Training starts next week, she said finally, handing him a form. Fill this out. Bring it back tomorrow with 2 references. We'll see how it goes. Hesse took the form. His left arm, Morrison's reconstruction, the steel pin still visible on X-rays though buried beneath healed tissue, functioned perfectly as he wrote his name, his address, his date of birth. The training was intensive, 6 weeks of protocols and procedures, of Geneva Convention requirements and displaced persons regulations, of the specific skills needed to navigate bureaucratic systems that had survived the war's end, even when the governments that created them had not. Hesse learned to write letters for people whose hands shook too badly to hold pens, to negotiate access to camps run by occupation authorities who viewed all Germans with suspicion, to trace the fates of missing family members through fragmentary records and survivor testimony. It was not soldiering, but it required the same careful attention to detail, the same ability to function under sustained exhaustion, the same necessity of separating emotion from the work at hand so the work could actually get done. In October, he was assigned to a team processing refugees in the American zone. They worked out of a warehouse that smelled of unwashed humanity and chemical toilets, interviewing hundreds of displaced persons each day, matching names against lists, filling out forms that would determine who could travel where. The Americans he worked with treated him with the same professional courtesy the hospital staff had shown. They checked his work, gave feedback on his interview technique, included him in briefings without comment on his nationality. One of them, a lieutenant from Ohio named Harrison, shared cigarettes during breaks and asked about his English accent, which apparently had a distinctly British inflection from the Canadian anesthesiologist who had practiced with him during recovery. You sound like you learned from a BBC broadcast, Harrison said, amused. Canadian doctor, Hesse corrected. He was very patient. Harrison nodded, not particularly interested in the story, and they went back to processing applications. The work continued for months, then years. Hesse moved through displaced persons camps and Red Cross offices and temporary hospitals set up to handle the aftermath of a continent's devastation. He wrote letters for people who would never see their families again, traced the fates of the missing through records that often ended in concentration camp rosters, distributed supplies to populations that had spent the war as targets rather than participants. It was repetitive, exhausting, often heartbreaking, but it operated according to principles he had come to trust during his weeks in that American hospital. You could not fix everything, could not undo the damage already done, could not make the insanity make sense. But you could choose how you responded to the wreckage. You could decide that even broken people were entitled to basic care and administrative competence, and someone who would listen to their stories without judgment. You could show up and do the work. In 1948, he encountered Morrison again. Pure chance. At a Red Cross coordination meeting in Munich, where the orthopedic surgeon was consulting on rehabilitation programs for amputees. They recognized each other instantly. Quote 50, Morrison said, extending his hand. Quote 51. Hessa shook his hand, the grip firm, no residual weakness. Quote, 52. Morrison looked genuinely pleased. Quote, 53. He said it without arrogance, just professional satisfaction in a job done right. Quotes at 54, quote, 50, quote, 56. Morrison glanced at his watch, already moving toward the next meeting. Quote, 57. Quote, 58. Hesse stopped him. Quote, 59. Morrison looked puzzled, the same expression Patterson had worn when Hesse asked which patients were German. Quote, 60. He left before Hesse could formulate a response. That's not how this works. The words stayed with Hesse through the rest of the conference, through the long train ride back to Frankfurt, through months of subsequent work. They were the clearest articulation he had heard of the principle that had restructured his understanding of service. There were rules that superseded nationality, obligations that transcended allegiance, ways of organizing human interaction that refused to make room for the calculations of vengeance or triumph. You treated the compound fracture because that was your job, and the job was defined by competence rather than ideology. In 1952, Hesse married a woman he met at a displaced persons camp, a Polish teacher who had survived Ravensbrück and still believed, despite considerable evidence to the contrary, that education could make people better. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and Hesse taught them both to tie bandages before they could properly tie their shoes. He never rejoined any military organization. Friends from his Wehrmacht days, men who had found postings in the new Bundeswehr when it was established in 1955, asked why. His rank and experience would have guaranteed a comfortable position, decent pay, the familiar structure of military life. Hesse declined without explanation. How could he explain that the war had taught him something his friends had not learned? That 23 days in an American field hospital had accomplished what 6 years of combat had not, shown him that the principles he thought he was fighting for, honor, duty, service, existed outside the machinery of state violence, and were in fact most authentically expressed when separated from it entirely. In 1958, during a late shift at a Red Cross tracing office, a younger colleague asked Hesse about his military service. It was an innocent question, asked without agenda by someone too young to have fought, who saw the war as history rather than personal experience. You were an officer, yes? What made you leave? Hesse thought about it, trying to find words for the transformation that had occurred in that hospital ward, for the slow collapse of certainty under the weight of experience. I was captured, he said finally. Injured. The Americans operated on my arm. He gestured at the limb, functional and strong. They treated me like... He paused, searching for the right word, and found it. Like a colleague, a professional, someone who deserved proper care regardless of which army I had served. The younger man nodded politely, not understanding. I realized, Hesse continued, that honor is not in the insignia. It is in how you bear another person's pain, whether you see them as an enemy or as a patient requiring intervention, whether you follow orders or principles. He stopped, aware he was not explaining it well. They showed me a different kind of service. Years later, long after the Red Cross work had transitioned into retirement, after his children had children of their own, Hesse's grandson found the old medical file in a box of papers, the surgery report, filled with Morrison's neat handwriting and Patterson's instrument counts, photographs from the ward, a letter from the Swiss doctor noting that the Wehrmacht officer was recovering satisfactorily. Quote 69. The grandson asked, quote 70. Hesse looked at the documents, those mundane records of bone realignment and morphine dosages and recovery protocols that had nonetheless changed the trajectory of his life. Quote 71, he said. Quote 72, quote 73. It was the question he had asked himself 1,000 times in 1,000 different contexts over 30 years of work that tried to repay a debt he could never fully articulate. Quote 74. Hesse said slowly, quote 75. He paused, quote 76. The grandson nodded, not quite understanding, but sensing the weight of it. Hesse returned the documents to their box, his rebuilt arm moving with the smooth efficiency Morrison had promised all those years ago. He thought about the night sky over the Ruhr, tearing apart in orange seams. The blast that had knocked him into mud and ended one life. The hands that had lifted him, careful, professional, unburdened by the hatreds that had brought them all to that terrible place. And he thought about the word the Swiss doctor had used, the one that had cut through all his expectations and forced him to reconstruct everything. Colleague. It had taken him 23 days in an American hospital to learn what 6 years of war had not taught him, that the truest honor lay not in victory or defeat, not in flags or ideologies, but in the quiet, persistent choice to treat suffering as something requiring remedy rather than justification, that you could be broken and still be worth fixing, that the work of repair, patient, methodical, indifferent to politics, was itself a form of resistance against the machinery of destruction. Morrison had given him back his arm, but in the process he had given him something larger, a framework for understanding service that did not require enemies, only the stubborn recognition that broken things demanded care, and care demanded competence, and competence demanded principles that transcended any individual allegiance. Hesse lived to see the Berlin Wall fall in 1989, to watch Germany reunite, to witness his grandchildren grow up in a world that could barely imagine the one he had survived. He died in 1993 at the age of 74, surrounded by family, his rebuilt arm still functioning perfectly after 48 years. At his funeral, his daughter read from a letter he had written late in life, trying to explain to his grandchildren what the war had taught him. Quote 77, the letter said. Quote 78. The letter ended there, but the room was silent for a long moment after his daughter finished reading. Epilogue, the architecture of mercy. In the decades following the war, thousands of German prisoners wrote memoirs, gave interviews, testified to their experiences in American captivity. The accounts varied in detail, but converged on certain persistent themes: the shock of adequate food when they had expected starvation, the adherence to Geneva Convention protocols when they had been taught to expect brutality, the strange cognitive dissonance of receiving medical care that met or exceeded what their own military had provided. These accounts were often dismissed as selective memory, as the natural tendency of defeated soldiers to reconstruct their captors as benevolent in order to rationalize surrender. And certainly individual experiences varied. There were instances of poor conditions, of neglect, of guards who brought their own hatreds to the work of managing prisoners. But the preponderance of evidence suggests something more systematic: a deliberate choice by the American military medical establishment to treat enemy wounded according to professional standards that superseded questions of nationality or allegiance. This was not mercy in the traditional sense, not a gift from the powerful to the powerless, not benevolence extended as a propaganda tool. It was something both more mundane and more radical: the application of medical ethics in circumstances specifically designed to make such ethics difficult. The doctors who operated on Hesse and tens of thousands like him were not saints. They were exhausted professionals working under impossible conditions, facing casualty rates that would have broken any system less rigorously organized. They made triage decisions that meant some men died, who might have been saved if resources were unlimited. They performed amputations on soldiers who would spend the rest of their lives as disabled. But within those constraints, they maintained standards. They refused to let political calculations determine medical care. They insisted that a compound fracture in a Wehrmacht officer required the same technical intervention as a compound fracture in an American private, and they backed that insistence with the full weight of military regulations and professional identity. Why? The easy answer is that the Geneva Conventions required it. That international law mandated equal treatment of prisoners. But laws are only as meaningful as their enforcement, and enforcement in combat zones is always negotiable. The harder answer is that these medical personnel had constructed an identity around competence and ethical practice that they were unwilling to compromise even under the pressures of total war. They fixed Hessa because leaving him broken would have violated their sense of who they were. In 2003, researchers at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum began a project to document the experiences of German prisoners of war in American captivity. Among the interviews collected was one with Johann Schmidt, a former Wehrmacht medic who had been captured in the Ardennes and spent the final months of the war in a POW hospital in Belgium. Schmidt described an incident that occurred in March of 1945, when the hospital received a transport of severely wounded Germans from a field aid station that had been overrun. One of them, a sergeant with a chest wound that had punctured his lung, was in critical condition, bleeding internally, his chances of survival minimal even with immediate intervention. Quote 79. Schmidt paused in the interview, his voice catching. Quote 80. Schmidt looked directly at the camera. Quote 81. The interview goes on, but that moment captures something essential about the system Hesse encountered: a refusal to let circumstance determine ethical practice, a commitment to standards that held even when, especially when, following them was difficult or futile. The broader historical question remains contested. Some scholars argue that American treatment of German POWs represented an intentional strategy to demonstrate the superiority of democratic values over fascist ideology, that the decision to treat prisoners well was fundamentally propagandistic, designed to undermine German will to fight and to create a positive foundation for post-war occupation. Others contend that it was simply pragmatic. Better treated prisoners were more likely to cooperate with interrogation, less likely to attempt escape, more amenable to re-education programs. Both arguments contain elements of truth, but they miss something that men like Hesse understood viscerally. The doctors and nurses who treated him were not thinking about propaganda or strategic advantage when they set his arm and monitored his concussion. They were thinking about fracture patterns and intracranial pressure and recovery protocols. They were operating within a professional framework that had been drilled into them through years of training, that defined their identity and their sense of competence. The political implications were secondary to the professional imperatives. This is not to say that the medical personnel were apolitical or naive about the larger context. Many of them had seen the photographs from liberated concentration camps, had treated survivors of Buchenwald and Dachau, knew with absolute clarity the nature of the regime they had been fighting. The moral clarity of the war was not in question. But in the operating room, in the recovery ward, in the daily work of managing human suffering, they maintained a separation between political judgment and medical practice. You could know that the Nazi regime was evil, that its soldiers had committed atrocities, that the war was justified, and still treat a Wehrmacht officer's broken arm with the same technical competence you would bring to any other patient. The two positions were not contradictory. They were complementary. You fought the war with absolute commitment, and you treated the casualties with absolute professionalism. One did not negate the other. Helmut Hessa's story is both exceptional and representative. Exceptional in its detail, in the particular circumstances that brought him to that American field hospital, in the specific trajectory of his post-war life. But representative in the larger pattern it illustrates, the collision between propaganda and experience, between ideology and empirical reality, between the narratives constructed to make war comprehensible and the stubborn facts that refuse to fit those narratives. Thousands of German soldiers experienced similar moments of cognitive dissonance in American captivity. Not all of them responded as Hessa did. Many returned to Germany and reconstructed their beliefs around new frameworks that preserved some version of their wartime identity. Some joined neo-Nazi organizations, unable or unwilling to accept the magnitude of what they had served. Others simply moved on, treating the war as a chapter closed, focusing on rebuilding lives in a new Germany. But for some, and Hessa was among them, the experience was transformative in ways that reshaped their understanding of service, obligation, and honor. The word Kiebus quote 82 that the Swiss doctor used so casually carried revolutionary implications. It suggested that professional identity could transcend national allegiance, that there existed standards of conduct independent of political ideology, that one could recognize the humanity and competence of an enemy without surrendering moral judgment of the cause he had served. It was a nuanced position, difficult to maintain, easy to mischaracterize. It did not mean that all sides were equivalent, that German and Allied conduct could be equated, that the war was anything other than a necessary fight against genuine evil. But it did mean that individual human beings, even those who had fought for evil causes, retained some essential worth that demanded recognition. The Americans who treated Hesse embodied that nuance. They saw him simultaneously as a patient requiring care and as a former enemy whose political allegiance they condemned. The two recognitions coexisted without canceling each other out. In the final years of his life, Hesse returned once to the site of his capture. The Ruhr had been rebuilt, the devastation of 1945 replaced by industrial infrastructure and suburban development. The specific field where the blast had knocked him unconscious was now a shopping district, the aid station long since dismantled, the hospital converted to civilian use and then replaced entirely. But Hesse found the location on a map, stood at the coordinates, tried to reconstruct in memory what the landscape had looked like under fire. A local historian who had been helping with his research asked what he was looking for. Quote 83. Hesse said, Quote 84. Quote 85. Hesse considered the question. Quote 86. He paused. Quote 87. The historian nodded. Quote 88. Quote 89. Hesse looked at the shopping district, at the normal life that had grown over the scarred ground. Quote 90. He turned to leave, then stopped. Quote 91, he said quietly. Quote 92. Oberleutnant Helmut Hesse died on the 19th of April, 1993, 48 years and 5 days after the blast that ended his war. His rebuilt arm, Morrison's steel pin still embedded in the bone, functioned perfectly until the end. At his funeral, his grandson, who had become a doctor himself, specializing in trauma surgery, read from a letter Hesse had written him years earlier. You asked me once why I never returned to military service after the war, why I chose the Red Cross instead. I will tell you something I have never fully articulated, not even to your grandmother. In that American hospital in 1945, I experienced something that shattered every belief I had constructed about honor and service, not through accusation or retribution that I could have resisted, but through the simple, stubborn insistence of medical professionals that my broken arm deserved competent care regardless of which flag I had served. They treated me like a colleague. That word, colleague, implied a shared professional identity that transcended our positions as enemies. It suggested that there existed standards of conduct independent of national allegiance, obligations that superseded political calculation. I spent the next 30 years trying to understand what that meant, trying to build a life around those principles. The Red Cross gave me a framework. You respond to suffering not because of who is suffering, but because suffering requires response. You provide aid not based on political calculation, but based on need and competence. It seems simple written down, but it requires the constant, exhausting discipline of separating the person from the cause they served, of recognizing humanity in those whose political choices you condemn. The Americans who saved my life embodied that discipline. They were not naive about who I was or what I had fought for, but they treated my broken arm anyway, with the same technical competence they would bring to any patient, because that was their standard and they refused to compromise it. That taught me more about honor than 6 years of military service ever did. When you operate on your patients, and I hope you will have a long, successful career doing exactly that, remember that your obligation is to the broken body before you, not to the political context that brought it to your table. Treat the compound fracture with competence and care, regardless of who owns the arm. That is the standard. Do not compromise it. That is what the Americans taught me in 1945. It is the most valuable lesson I ever learned. Your OPA Who loves you? The church was silent when the grandson finished reading. Outside, the spring afternoon was bright and warm, the kind of day that makes it difficult to imagine that this same landscape had once been torn by war, had once been a place where young men killed each other with industrial efficiency, where ideology and hatred and fear had transformed normal human beings into instruments of state violence. But Helmut Hessa had lived through that transformation and its aftermath, had felt the certainties collapse, had learned to rebuild his sense of service on different foundations, had spent 30 years trying to repay a debt to Americans who probably never thought of their work as creating debt. They had simply done their jobs, had treated the broken arm because that was the standard, had moved on to the next patient without reflection on the larger implications. The mundane, unremarkable nature of their professionalism was precisely what made it revolutionary. There is a photograph, grainy and slightly out of focus, taken in the recovery ward of the 55th Field Hospital in April of 1945. It shows a row of beds occupied by wounded soldiers. If you know what you're looking for, you can identify Helmut Hessa. Third bed from the left, his arm in a cast elevated on a frame, his face still showing the pallor of recent surgery and concussion. The photograph is unremarkable. Just another administrative record from a war that generated millions of such images. There is nothing in it to suggest that the man in the third bed was experiencing a fundamental transformation, that the professional care he was receiving would reshape his understanding of service and obligation, that he would spend the rest of his life trying to honor the principles demonstrated by the tired medical staff barely visible at the edge of the frame. But that is the nature of transformation. It often occurs in unremarkable circumstances, through the accumulation of small moments rather than dramatic revelations. A nurse setting a splint with careful precision, a doctor checking pupils with professional competence, an anesthesiologist whispering encouragement in accented German, a Swiss doctor using the word "was," quote 94, say, without thinking about its implications. Moments that meant everything to the man receiving them and almost nothing to the people providing them. That asymmetry is perhaps the most important lesson. The most profound acts of human decency are often the ones we perform without reflection, simply because they align with our sense of professional identity or ethical obligation. We do not think we are changing lives. We are just doing our jobs. But for the people on the receiving end, for men like Helmut Hessa, whose entire framework of understanding had been constructed on lies and whose arm hung at an unnatural angle in the mud of a collapsing front. Those unremarkable professional acts can be revolutionary. They can be the thing that rebuilds you. The blast that knocked Hesse off his feet on the 14th of April, 1945, ended one life. The hands that lifted him, careful, competent, unburdened by the hatreds that had brought them all to that terrible place, began another. He spent 48 years trying to honor what they had taught him, that you treat the broken thing before you with the competence it deserves, that professional standards transcend political allegiance, that some obligations exist independent of ideology. That honor is not in the insignia, but in how you bear another person's pain. That was the lesson of the American Field Hospital. That was what Helmut Hessa carried home from captivity. That was the architecture he built when the old certainties collapsed. And in the end, perhaps, that was enough.